Thank you, David, for that very kind introduction. I put the line in there about being an honorary admiral in the great Navy of the state of Nebraska to see who actually reads CVs, and the dean reads CVs. So I give you a great deal of credit for that. I have the little plaque in my office, and occasionally it excites comments from students, as you might imagine. I first became interested in this topic in December of 1999. When at the Des Moines Register debate, the Republican candidates for the presidential nomination, were asked, who is your favorite political philosopher? And as some of you remember, the governor of Texas replied that Jesus was his favorite political philosopher. And like a lot of people, I kind of scratched my head at that, thinking that's a really interesting response to a question like that. And I don't fault Governor Bush for giving that answer. It's a tough question. What would you answer if you were asking that question? Who is your favorite political philosopher? Machiavelli probably would not be the right choice at that moment. So it wasn't so much the answer, but I got thinking about that, and as a historian, my mind went back 40 years earlier to John F. Kennedy and his run for the presidency in 1960. And it occurred to me that, at least on the face of it, there was a huge distance between Kennedy's speech before the Greater Houston Ministerial Association in 1960 and George W. Bush's declaration that Jesus was his favorite political philosopher. So it occurred to me that there was a story there, and I wanted to tell the story about the narrative arc between those two events in 1960 and then again in 2000. And that's what motivated this book, God in the White House, How Faith Shaped the Presidency, from John F. Kennedy to George W. Bush. And so what I'd like to do is kind of take you on a little historical romp, if I could, for the next few minutes to talk about how we got from point A to point B. To understand point A, however, we have to go back a little bit further to 1928, the first time that a major party nominee for president was a Roman Catholic, and that, of course, was Alfred E. Smith, the governor of New York, and the Democratic nominee for president in 1928. That campaign took place amidst recrudescence of the Ku Klux Klan. The first Klan, of course, had begun during the Reconstruction period, and the second Klan was triggered really by the publication of Thomas Dixon's novel, The Klansman, picked up in the great in the sense of monumental motion picture, Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith. So in the 1920s, there was a surge of membership into the Ku Klux Klan, and the Klan also expanded its list of enemies, not merely African Americans, but also Roman Catholics, Jews, and foreign-born Americans. And so, as you might imagine, in 1928, Alfred E. Smith and his candidacy attracted a lot of attention from the Ku Klux Klan. They were building on anti-Catholic sentiment, as you might imagine. There were a lot of popular rumors about the effect of electing a Catholic as president of the United States and how the republic would suffer if that were the case. One of the rumors was that should a Catholic become president, that all Protestant marriages would be annulled, and therefore any children of those marriages would be declared illegitimate. My favorite, however, was the popular myth that should Alfred Smith be elected president of the United States, that he would immediately undertake to extend the Holland Tunnel underneath the Atlantic Ocean and into the basement of the Vatican. Smith's opponent, of course, was Herbert Hoover, a Quaker from West Branch, Iowa, actually running for the first time for elective office. How's that? You run for president the first time you decide to become a public servant. He had been Secretary of Commerce, of course, and was a great humanitarian, in fact, one of the great humanitarians of the 20th century. But he was running for the first time for political office, and he was able to beat Alfred E. Smith in 1928. According to popular lore, on election night when the results came in, Alfred E. Smith sent a telegram to the Vatican saying, "Unpack." Between 1928 and the 1950s, when the junior senator from Massachusetts began to think about running for president of the United States, Catholics had made huge strides in American society. I'm sure you know the story. When I talk about it with my undergraduates, I tend to mention the importance of the GI Bill of Rights in 1944. Not only had American Catholics vindicated their patriotism by fighting in World War II, many times against the very nations where their families had immigrated. The GI Bill of Rights allowed them to go to places like Fordham and Georgetown and other schools as well, and to get an education, become upwardly mobile, move into the middle class, and become more fully Americans in the 1940s and 1950s. So Kennedy was certainly aware of that when he began to think about running for president. He was also aware that there was lingering anti-Catholicism in American society. And one evidence for that is a book that was published in 1949 by Beacon Press here in Boston called American Freedom and Catholic Power. Now, like many of you, I expect, being professors or being interested in the life of the mind, you spend a good bit of time in used bookstores. And I can't tell you how many times over the years I've run across American Freedom and Catholic Power in used bookstores, written by Paul Blanchard, arguing that the canons of democracy were fundamentally incompatible with Roman Catholicism. And the corollary, of course, would be that if Americans ever elected a Roman Catholic as president, they would be jeopardizing American democracy. This was not a new argument. This argument had been part of nativist discourse going back into the 19th century. But what made this book different was its author. The author was not some kind of fringe nativist crank. He was instead someone who had been educated at the University of Michigan and Union Theological Seminary, someone who had studied at both Columbia and, I hate to tell you, Harvard universities. And he was making this argument in this book, American Freedom and Catholic Power, the chapters of which originally appeared in The Nation magazine. Beacon Press published or released 11 editions, 11 printings of this book in 11 months when it was published in 1949. This was a very popular book and a very popular argument. And Kennedy was aware that he had to deal with this issue if he wanted to be president of the United States. In the 1950s, Kennedy made a play in the 1956 Democratic National Convention to be named the running mate for Adlai Stevenson, who, of course, was running a second time for president against Dwight Eisenhower. And at the convention, Kennedy put forward his name as one of the possibilities for running mate. Stevenson had left it open to the convention who they would choose as his vice presidential running mate. Part of the argument was that Kennedy would be a good choice because he was a Roman Catholic and therefore a good family man. We can debate that, I guess, in light of what we know now. But he would be able to negate some of the negative publicity coming to the Democratic ticket because Stevenson himself was divorced. Alas, during that convention, the delegates turned to Estes Kefauver of Tennessee rather than John F. Kennedy. But he had made the point that, at least in the eyes of many Democrats, that having a Roman Catholic on the ticket would not necessarily jeopardize the chances of the ticket. And so over the ensuing 4 years, he begins to think about running for president of the United States. Kennedy announced his candidacy for the Democratic nomination, you'll appreciate the date here, on January 2nd, 1960. Gives you a sense of how the presidential primary calendar has expanded. This past year, or actually this year, the Iowa precinct caucuses took place on January 3rd of this year, so you have a sense of how things have expanded over the years. And Kennedy was aware that at some point he probably would have to address the religion question in the course of the campaign. Although Jackie, his wife, wasn't sure why that would be necessary. As she said at one point in the campaign, everybody makes such a big deal about Jack being a Catholic, but he's such a bad Catholic. She was utterly uncomprehending about this. The real test for the Kennedy campaign, at least in the primaries, occurred in West Virginia. At that point, and this was in May, the West Virginia primary pitted John Kennedy against Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic senator from Minnesota, as the two primary candidates still contending for the Democratic nomination in an overwhelmingly Protestant state. Humphrey sought to take advantage of religion. His campaign bus going around Virginia was blaring out, "Give me that old-time religion," to the masses as he tried to rally troops to his side. And Kennedy was so worried about this that on Sunday evening, before the Tuesday primary, he went on television in West Virginia and made an appeal to voters to consider him on his merits and not merely on his faith. 2 days later, in fact, Kennedy did prevail, winning 60.8% of the vote in the West Virginia primary over Hubert Humphrey, who withdrew from the nomination process the following day. At Charleston, West Virginia, on election night, Kennedy declared, "I think we've now finally buried the religious issue in this campaign." Little did he know. When I was doing research for the book at the JFK Library here in Boston, I ran across a letter from Billy Graham to Senator John F. Kennedy, dated August 10th, 1960. It is, as you might imagine, a very cordial, friendly letter, and I'll paraphrase it. I don't have it exactly in my head. The letter read, "Dear Senator Kennedy, there's been a lot of speculation in the Democratic Party that I intend to raise the religious issue in this campaign. This is not true. I have no intention of raising the religious issue in this campaign." 8 days later, August 18th, 1960, Billy Graham convened a meeting of American Protestant ministers in Montreux, Switzerland, to discuss ways that they could deny Kennedy's election in November. Present at that meeting, among others, was Norman Vincent Peale, pastor of Marble Collegiate Church in New York City. And the follow-on that meeting was another gathering of Protestant ministers on September 5th, 1960, right after Labor Day, the traditional start of the fall campaign, at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington. These ministers gathered behind closed doors to again discuss or raise the alarm about the possibility of a Roman Catholic being president of the United States. After the gathering, the leaders of the meeting, Norman Vincent Peale, Harold John Ockenga, at that time president of Fuller Theological Seminary, later to become president of Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, had a news conference. Billy Graham was not at the meeting, by the way. They had a news conference, and the press said, "What are you guys talking about?" "Well, we're talking about the dangers of a Roman Catholic being president of the United States." Somebody asked, "Well, Senator Kennedy has made repeated assurances about his fidelity to the notion of the separation of church and state, the First Amendment, and so forth." Whereupon Harold John Ockenga compared Kennedy's statements on the separation of church and state to Nikita Khrushchev's statements about world peace. One of the, I gather, more puckish journalists present at this news conference said, "Well, Kennedy's opponent in this fall campaign is Richard Nixon, a Quaker. Quakers historically are pacifists. Did you discuss how Richard Nixon's Quakerism might affect his conduct as president of the United States?" Whereupon Peale replied in what I'm sure was an unintentionally funny comment. He said about Nixon and his Quakerism, "I'm not sure he's ever let it bother him." Nevertheless, because of that meeting at the Mayflower Hotel, the Kennedy campaign, which at that time was campaigning on the West Coast in Oregon and later in California, began hearing questions from reporters about the religious issue and what Kennedy had to say about the religious issue. And that is what emboldened them to address the issue head on. Part of it also was, and I came across this correspondence in the Kennedy Library as well, part of it was repeated entreaties from people like John Kenneth Galbraith and Archibald Cox of Harvard, who were informal advisors of the Kennedy campaign that kept saying, "You've got to address this issue lest it festers and really jeopardizes your candidacy." And so on September 12th, 1960, at the Grand Ballroom in the Rice Hotel in downtown Houston, Texas, John Kennedy stood before 300 Protestant ministers and gave his famous address to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association. I think it's quite a remarkable speech. David quoted from part of that speech. But Kennedy made, I think, several points. First of all, he reiterated his support for the First Amendment, the separation of church and state. He counseled voters effectively to disregard a candidate's faith when they went into the voting booth. He also made the point at the end of the speech that if 40 million Catholics, at that time the number of Catholics in America, forfeited their chance at the presidency on the day of their baptism, then it was America that was the loser in that quotient. I think that Kennedy's speech was so effective. It not only catapulted him to the presidency in November of that year, but it ushered in a period in American politics of what I call the Kennedy paradigm of voter indifference to a candidate's faith. And I'm going to test that right now by asking, and I know this, I'm dealing with a pretty savvy crowd here, so this may backfire on me, but can somebody tell me Lyndon Johnson's religious affiliation? Yes, somebody know. Come on, Ann. Disciples of Christ, yes. Most people don't get it. See, you're too smart here. Most people guess Baptist because his mother was a devout Baptist. In fact, Johnson's decision to become a member of the Disciples of Christ seems to be something of an adolescent rebellion. There seems to be a woman involved too, which wouldn't be surprising if anybody knows Johnson's history. And when he told Rebecca, his mother, she cried extensively when she learned that her son was becoming a member of the Disciples of Christ rather than a Baptist. But the purpose in framing that question is to point out that most Americans don't have any idea what Lyndon Johnson's religious affiliation was. And in fact, he was not an overtly or openly pious man by any stretch of the imagination. But the Kennedy paradigm, I think, was very much in place in American politics from Kennedy's speech in Houston. And by the way, that was a very hostile crowd that he was addressing with the Greater Houston Ministerial Association until the mid-1970s. And I will go back to my narrative here in a minute, but I just want to illustrate this a little bit further. In 1968, as many of you know and some of you remember, the leading candidate for the Republican nomination going into the presidential primaries was the governor of Michigan, a man by the name of George Romney, also a Mormon, like his son Mitt, and his religion was no factor whatsoever in the 1968 Republican primaries. We were very much, as a country, amidst this Kennedy paradigm of voter indifference to a candidate's faith. I happened to be living in Michigan at the time, in 1968, and I remember nothing whatsoever about George Romney's Mormonism being a factor in that campaign. And in writing the book, I went back to make sure I hadn't missed something about that, and it's simply not an issue. It was not an issue in that campaign because we voters were indifferent. What changed it, of course, was Nixon, right? The Nixon administration and the corruptions in the Nixon administration. All of a sudden, we as voters became interested once again in knowing something about our presidential candidates and their faith, and I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. Let's go back to Johnson. Johnson is a fascinating individual of Shakespearean dimensions. Bill Moyers, his longtime assistant, said that Lyndon Johnson was 13 of the most fascinating people he'd ever met. When I was down in Austin at the LBJ Library, I heard a story that I found really intriguing, and I included it in the chapter. The story is that Johnson was working late at night in the White House one night with his aides, which he did almost all the time. He was virtually tireless. He worked virtually 24 hours a day and demanded that his associates do the same. But they were having working dinner at the White House, and before they began dinner, Johnson asked Bill Moyers, his assistant, at the other end of the table, also an ordained minister, to say grace before they began eating. So Moyers starts praying, and almost immediately Johnson interrupted and said, "Speak up, Moyers, I can't hear you." Whereupon, according to the story, Bill Moyers replied in a quiet, even voice, "I wasn't speaking to you, sir." I love this story, and I included it in my draft of my chapter on Lyndon Johnson. And then as it happened, and I don't want to give the wrong impression here, Bill Moyers and I are not best friends or in close contact or regular contact. But our paths have crossed a little bit over the years, and he happened to contact me about something as I was trying to figure out Lyndon Johnson, and I mentioned this, and he said, in effect, good luck trying to figure out Lyndon Johnson. But I asked if he'd read a draft of my chapter, and he did. He was very gracious and sent back some nice comments, but he confirmed that story is true. So that story it's a wonderful story about Johnson. Johnson was not, as I said earlier, an openly religious or pious man, but he learned from his mother a simple moral precept. And that precept was that the strong have an obligation to care for the weak. And I believe that Lyndon Johnson actually sought to live or to govern as an elected official by that precept. This helps to explain, for example, why Lyndon Johnson, a white Southerner, as Majority Leader of the Senate, pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1957. As president, he pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, even though he recognized at the time, there's a great story about Moyers and Johnson on the night that he signs the Civil Rights Act, and Johnson is glum, even though this was one of his great legislative triumphs. And Moyers said, "Why are you so dejected?" He said, I've just turned over the South to the Republican Party for the next generation." He was absolutely right about that. But why would he do that? Because he actually sought to live according to that precept that the strong have an obligation to care for the weak. I think it also explains his Great Society ambitions, which he laid out in his commencement address at the University of Michigan in 1964. The war on poverty, the Medicare system, all of the components of the Great Society, much reviled these days in the political arena, but Johnson believed that was appropriate because the strong in society have an obligation to care for the weak. Tragically, it also explains his involvement in Vietnam. And I ran across several quotations to this effect. We are involved in Vietnam because the strong have an obligation to care for the weak when the wolf is at the door. And that was his phrase to describe that. And so the very moral precept that defined in many ways his greatest triumphs as president also led him to his greatest disappointment and arguably his downfall as president of the United States with Vietnam. At the end of March in 1968, Lyndon Johnson, after the New Hampshire primary, shocked the political world, shocked the world for that matter, by announcing that he would not run for a second term as president of the United States. Throws open the whole process, and the Democrats implode in the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and Richard Nixon is elected president of the United States in 1968. When the founders were crafting the Constitution of the United States, they made, even back in that time, in the late 18th century, a remarkable concession to religious pluralism, not only the First Amendment, but in the Constitution itself, which provided that any president taking the oath of office had the option either to swear that he would uphold the Constitution of the United States or merely to affirm that he would uphold the Constitution of the United States, a concession, of course, to the Quakers. And in fact, when Herbert Hoover took the oath of office on March 4th, 1929, he affirmed that he would uphold the Constitution of the United States. As Inauguration Day in 1969 rolled around, Richard Nixon was given the option either to affirm or to swear his fealty to the Constitution of the United States. But as we all learned about Nixon, he had no aversion to swearing, and he swore that he would uphold the Constitution of the United States. The Nixon administration is, of course, notorious for all sorts of things. Religiously, one of the most memorable dimensions of that administration was the White House prayer services that Nixon conducted. Some of you remember this. Led by people like Norman Vincent Peale, Billy Graham, but also a remarkably broad range of ecumenical religious leaders who would come to the White House for religious services on Sunday morning. Very quickly, however, This devolved into a kind of political theater. I ran across a memorandum from Chuck Colson, who of course was one of Nixon's aides in the White House, and he had been given instructions in no uncertain terms from the Oval Office that he was to invite well-placed Republican donors or potential Republican donors to these White House religious services. The Nixon administration, of course, devolves into the Watergate scandal and the White House tapes, which were made public. Billy Graham, who was Nixon's friend, was always seeing great morality in Nixon and his administration. Finally read the transcripts of the tape and pronounced himself physically sickened by what he had read, not, it turns out, by Nixon's several attempts to frustrate justice and to subvert the Constitution of the United States, but because Nixon used bad language. He didn't like that. Nixon resigns, of course, in August of 1974, and Gerald Ford, the only person to occupy the Oval Office who had never been elected either president or vice president of the United States, having come to office through a kind of circuitous route because of the resignation of Spiro Agnew, the vice president, and then later, of course, the resignation of Richard Nixon. Gerald Ford was an Episcopalian, a very active layman in the Alexandria Episcopal Church. And I think that Gerald Ford actually tried to govern by his moral lights and his precepts. The most defining moment for Gerald Ford and his presidency was, of course, his decision a month into his administration to offer a preemptive pardon to Richard Nixon. And in his address to the nation, it becomes clear to me that he did so in part for religious reasons. Part of his address reads, "I do believe with all my heart and mind and spirit that I, not as president, but as a humble servant of God, will receive justice without mercy if I fail to show mercy." And this was part of his justification for pardoning Nixon. People have criticized that over the years. Certainly at the time it was subject to a torrent of criticism, not least from his own press secretary, Gerald Horst, who resigned in protest only a month into the Ford administration. But many newspapers, certainly many politicians on both sides of the aisle, thought that was inappropriate to do so, especially because Ford did not pardon Nixon's associates, who are also facing legal troubles. But I think historians have generally, or history has generally borne him out, that Gerald Ford did the right thing at that moment in history. He did the right thing in offering this preemptive pardon of Nixon as a way of trying to heal the nation. And in fact, when his successor was inaugurated as president, the first thing that Jimmy Carter did was to thank Gerald Ford for what he had done in his brief presidency to heal the United States of America. It's also during the Ford administration that you have a different Billy in the White House. It wasn't Billy Graham. It was a man by the name of Billy Zeoli. I wonder if anybody remembers that name. Billy Zeoli was from Grand Rapids, Michigan. It was kind of a cartoonish figure, at least that's how I remember him, who was president of an organization called Gospel Films. He and Gerald Ford had formed some sort of friendship when Ford was representing Grand Rapids in Congress. And one of the things that Billy Zeoli does is leave devotional, little handwritten, or actually typed out devotionals on Gerald Ford's desk every Monday morning. And these little devotionals are in the Gerald Ford Library in Ann Arbor. And they were all, the title for all of them, the collective title was "God's Got a Better Idea." Some of you are old enough to remember a Ford motor company advertising slogan about that time called "Ford's Got a Better Idea." Of course, this was a play on words with Gerald Ford and so forth. A little too cute, perhaps, but each of these missives begins, "Dear Jerry." Here he is addressing the President of the United States by his first name, and then he would offer these little commentary, kind of devotionals, commentaries for the benefit of Gerald Ford. And so it was Billy Zeoli, not Billy Graham, who was hanging around the White House during the Ford administration. I said earlier that I think the Kennedy paradigm really comes to a close with the Nixon administration. And what I mean by that is that I think it's virtually impossible to imagine an obscure one-term governor of Georgia becoming president of the United States had it not been for Nixon. So in a backhanded way, Nixon is responsible for the reintroduction of this language of faith and piety into presidential politics. Jimmy Carter was in many ways the perfect vehicle, the perfect conduit for this new way of thinking. He was a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher. He made no secret about that. And at a campaign event in Winston-Salem, North Carolina in March of 1976, he was asked by one of the neighbors there in this backyard barbecue if he was a born-again Christian. And Jimmy Carter said, yes, of course I'm a born-again Christian, thereby sending every journalist in New York to his Rolodex to figure out what in the world he was talking about. But evangelicals heard that, and they understood that language. They understood that Jimmy Carter was speaking their language. His whole campaign was about justice and making right after the corruptions of the Nixon years. He promised he would never knowingly lie to the American people. I have trouble these days persuading my undergraduates how important that statement was. The notion in the mid-1970s that a president would not lie to us was just almost unheard of. Many of you remember this. But it worked, and Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976. Despite his Playboy interview, which appeared just before the election, that scandalized a lot of people when he used some fairly crude language to talk about marital relations, or rather extramarital relations, and that cost him some at the end of the campaign, but nevertheless, he was elected, of course, in 1976. I think Jimmy Carter actually sought to govern according to his moral principles. The renegotiation of the Panama Canal Treaty, even though it was very much in the works back into the Ford administration, even the Nixon administration, Jimmy Carter pushed that through the Senate for ratification and expended a great deal of political capital in so doing. He also thought that some sort of real peace in the Middle East was important. He staked a lot personally and politically on the Mideast peace process, and most historians agree, I think, that Jimmy Carter advanced that peace process probably more than any other president since the formation of Israel in May of 1948. Jimmy Carter also was president during the rise of the religious right. And here I want to take a minute to talk about this and what I call the abortion myth. The leaders of the religious right have invested a great deal of energy arguing that it was the Roe v. Wade decision that got them involved in politics. After the Roe v. Wade decision in January of 1973, they shed their political apathy and, albeit reluctantly, plunged into the political arena in order to reverse the moral abomination of the Roe v. Wade ruling. They even went so far, many of them, to characterize themselves as the new abolitionists, trying to draw a parallel between their opposition to abortion and the opposition of 19th century evangelicals to the scourge of slavery. It's a great story, and it is also utter fiction. The Methodists, meeting in Atlanta in 1972, passed a resolution calling for the legalization of abortion. The Southern Baptists, meeting in St. Louis in 1971, also passed a resolution calling for the legalization of abortion, a resolution that they reiterated in 1974 and again in 1976. When the Roe v. Wade ruling was handed down, several prominent evangelicals, including the redoubtable W.A. Criswell, pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, expressed satisfaction with the Roe v. Wade ruling as marking an appropriate distinction between personal morality and public policy. For evangelicals in the 1970s, abortion was a Catholic issue. It was not what mobilized them as a political force. This is what I call the abortion myth. What got them politicized? Well, it's a more complicated story, but I'll try to give you a brief version of it. It was a court decision, but it was a lower court decision, the District Court, District of Columbia, and a decision in a case called Green v. Connolly, handed down on June 30th, 1971. The background for Green v. Connolly is that by the late 60s, early 70s, the Internal Revenue Service was trying to find ways to enforce the provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that forbade racial discrimination and racial segregation. In so doing, the Internal Revenue Service issued an opinion that said any organization that engages in racial segregation or racial discrimination is not, by definition, a charitable organization. Therefore, it has no claims on tax-exempt status. Similarly, contributions, donations coming into any such organization no longer will qualify for tax exemption. The District Court, District of Columbia, upheld the Internal Revenue Service in that decision. And in the ensuing years, the IRS began to enforce that provision by rescinding the tax exemption of many of the so-called segregation academies that grew up in the South after the Brown v. Board of Education ruling in 1954. But they also targeted a fundamentalist school in Greenville, South Carolina called Bob Jones University, which until 1971 did not admit African Americans to its student body, until 1975 did not admit unmarried African Americans to its student body out of fears of racial mixing. This is what got preachers like Jerry Falwell mobilized in the political arena. The other factor was Anita Bryant, remember that name? Anita Bryant's crusade, Save the Children crusade in Miami-Dade County, Florida, against the legislation that would have provided equal rights to gays and lesbians. These two factors are what got evangelicals politicized in the late 1970s, what became the religious right. Now, I have a lot of authorities on this, and I'm happy to give you more, but I'll give you one that corroborates this. And that's Paul Weyrich, who is arguably the architect of the religious right. For reasons that, frankly, I don't understand myself, in November of 1990, I was invited to Washington, D.C. for a small conference of various people. I got into the room, and in addition to people like George Marsden and Grant Wacker, there was Richard Land, Ralph Reed was there, Donald Wildman, head of the American Family Association, Ed Dobson, who had been one of Falwell's lieutenants in Moral Majority. And the purpose, as I gather, was a discussion about the religious right and evangelicals and politics. In the course of the first session, Paul Weyrich made this impassioned speech saying abortion had nothing to do with the religious right. This was not our issue. This was not what got us involved in the political process. So the discussion continued, and shortly thereafter there was a break, and I went to Weyrich and I said, I want to make sure I understood you correctly on this. Abortion is not why the religious right got going as a political movement. He said, absolutely not. It was the Bob Jones case, is essentially what he told me. It was the IRS going after the tax exemption of these schools. He said abortion came in later. I said, well, how'd that come about? He said, once we got going, once we got mobilized in the Bob Jones issue, then there was a conference call among these various leaders of the religious right, or who became leaders of the religious right, and someone said in this conference call, we have the makings here of a political movement. What other issues can we talk about? According to Weyrich, several people made suggestions, and then finally, a voice on the end of one of the lines said, how about abortion? And that's how abortion, according to Paul Weyrich, was cobbled into the political agenda of the religious right in the late 1970s, not in direct response to the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973. I call this the abortion myth. Nevertheless, it was quite effective. Abortion starts to make headway as a political issue, that is in elective politics, in 1978. Up in Minnesota, and then again later in Iowa. And I'll just do this quickly and move on. In 1978, in Minnesota, there was a Senate election to replace Hubert Humphrey as senator. Humphrey had died, and then his wife Muriel had been appointed interim senator, but she was not going to keep the seat. And so the Democrats had a primary. And the two contestants were Donald Frazier, a longtime Democratic congressman from Minnesota, who was the odds-on favorite to win the nomination. But the other contender was a pro-life Democrat, Bob Short, who was also at that time the owner of the Minnesota Twins. And in that primary election, Bob Short was able to prevail over Donald Frazier in that for the nomination, for the Republican nomination for that Senate seat. Short eventually lost, but that showed people like Paul Weyrich in Washington that abortion is a potent political issue. More to the point, just south of Minnesota in Iowa, helping out with geography, for those who don't know, the Democratic senator was running for re-election. The Democratic senator by the name of Dick Clark, it's not the Dick Clark you're thinking of, it's a different Dick Clark, who was very popular in part because when he ran for the Senate the first time 6 years earlier, he had walked across the state of Iowa and was, really had a populist touch. And all the pundits thought that Dick Clark would sail easily to re-election. His opponent was Roger Jepson, the Republican. And on the final weekend of that campaign, before the November general election, pro-life individuals, Catholics, leafleted church parking lots in Iowa. And 2 days later, in an election with a very low turnout, Roger Jepson upset Dick Clark for the Senate seat from Iowa. This further persuaded Paul Weyrich and others in Washington that abortion would work for them as a political issue. The following year, Francis Schaeffer and C. Everett Koop were part of a film series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race that was produced by Schaeffer's son, Frank Schaeffer. And this circulated throughout North America, and evangelicals, many of them went to see this movie. This was making a case against abortion. And that is what politicized evangelicals on the abortion issue, again, in the late 1970s, not in response to the Roe v. Wade, not in direct response to the Roe v. Wade ruling. Evangelicals regarded abortion as a Catholic issue throughout most of the 1970s. So 1980 comes along. Even though Newsweek had declared 1976 the year of the evangelical, I think they were 4 years premature because you had not one or two, but three major candidates for president who all claimed to be evangelical Christians. Jimmy Carter, of course, who had proven his evangelical background when he ran in 1976, running for re-election. Ronald Reagan, who also claimed to be an evangelical Christian, even though he's a little fuzzy on what being born again meant. And then finally, John B. Anderson. Some of you may remember that name, Republican congressman from Rockford, Illinois, who mounted an independent third-party bid for the presidency in 1980. John Anderson actually is from the same denomination in which I was reared, the Evangelical Free Church of America. In fact, full disclosure, I worked for him in Washington in 1975 up on Capitol Hill. He too was an evangelical. All three of them were making a play for the evangelical vote. So important was this evangelical vote. But Ronald Reagan was able to win the majority of evangelicals in 1980. The turning point, I think, arguably in terms of religion for that campaign was an event called the National Affairs Briefing in Dallas, Texas at Reunion Arena on August 22nd, 1980, when you had preachers like Jerry Falwell and James Robeson addressing over 10,000 evangelicals. And then Reagan got up on the dais and then famously said about this group, "I know this group can't endorse me, but I endorse you and what you're doing," brought down the House and arguably sealed the election for Ronald Reagan in 1980. Ronald Reagan was a complex man, no question about it. He ran as an anti-abortion candidate in 1980, even though as governor of California in 1967, he had signed into law one of the most liberal abortion bills in the country. By 1980, he had converted to the pro-life cause, and many evangelicals had begun to regard that as their litmus test for who they would support for president of the United States. Ronald Reagan promised to outlaw abortion. He did not, of course, outlaw abortion. For what it's worth, I will point out that in his autobiography that he wrote after leaving office, over 600 pages, the issue of abortion occurs not once in that autobiography. I will let you interpret that for yourself. 1988, you had Pat Robertson, the televangelist, running for the Republican nomination, in fact, making a play. For that, I was writing Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory at that time, so I went to Iowa for the Iowa precinct caucuses, and the following week to New Hampshire for the first primary of the election season. And I was watching evangelicals getting used to the political process. I spent some time with evangelical women in particular, who talked about lobbying from the kitchen table. That is, embracing their roles both as housewives, and this is a term that they would use to describe themselves, as well as political activists in 1988. Iowa voters were faced with a choice between two candidates, Jack Kemp, the congressman from New York, and Pat Robertson, the televangelist. Pat Robertson actually finished second in the Iowa precinct caucuses in 1988, just behind Bob Dole and ahead of George H.W. Bush, who eventually won the nomination. George H.W. Bush had the support of Jerry Falwell in 1988, which is not insignificant, I think, helped him catapult him to the presidency, even though he too was a little bit confused about what it meant to be born again. At one point he was asked if he was born again Christian. He said, "Yes, I am." I'm not sure what it means, but yes, I am a born again Christian. 1992 and 1996, as far as I can tell, is the only time in American history when we had an all Southern Baptist ticket running for president. Bill Clinton and Al Gore, even though the Southern Baptist Convention wanted nothing to do with either one of them by that point. And I think in part Clinton, with his ease in churches, particularly black churches, was able to peel off enough voters from the Republican Party in order to win election and re-election in 1992 and 1996. Of course, you have the Monica Lewinsky scandal. I'm trying to finish up here to provide time for questions. Monica Lewinsky scandal, and if you read some of Bill Clinton's public declarations after that scandal broke, he was a broken man. He was a contrite man. And some of his statements to various prayer breakfasts and so forth are really quite remarkable. The religious right, of course, viewed the Clinton administration as a kind of interregnum between George H.W. Bush and whoever they would elect in 2000. And in 2000, of course, we have George Bush running from, governor of Texas, running for the Republican nomination. And using his religion, using his religious background, his religious experience as a springboard to the presidency, to the nomination first, and then to the presidency. George W. Bush claimed to be an evangelical Christian. I'm not disputing that. I am not in any position to judge the spiritual condition of others, but there are at least two conversion experiences in the George W. Bush history. One is when an itinerant revivalist by the name of Arthur Blessitt came to Midland, Texas in 1984. At that time, George W. Bush was trying to make it in the oil business, not doing terribly well, struggling personally and struggling certainly with alcohol. And George Bush arranges for a lunch meeting with Arthur Blessitt there in Midland, Texas. 3 hours later, George Bush gives his heart to Jesus. He's converted, he's born again. These are all synonymous terms, as I'm sure you know, about evangelical religious experience. And he tries to set his life aright. The following summer, George and Barbara Bush, the parents, are still so concerned about the soul of their son and his direction that they summon Billy Graham to come visit the family when they are vacationing up at Walker's Point in Kennebunkport, Maine. And this is when George W. Bush has his famous walk on the beach with Billy Graham, and he gives his heart once again to Jesus. Some people have quibbled with this account. Billy Graham apparently has no recollection of this walk on the beach. Those of you who've seen Walker's Point will recognize that there's no beach, but it is clear that something happened. George W. Bush really turns his life around. Not so much perhaps that summer in 1984, but the following year during a ski trip to Colorado when he's once again inebriated, and he decides at that point to give up alcohol and to reform his life. He goes on to become president of the Texas Rangers, and then moving on to become governor of Texas, and then to the presidency. And that we come back full circle to the debate in Des Moines, Iowa on December 13th, 1999, when George W. Bush declared that Jesus was his favorite political philosopher. I want to take questions if that's all right. So I'm going to kind of wrap up here by reading a little bit from the conclusion here. If the presidency suffers from an inflection of religious criteria, faith itself is also damaged by politicization. Can anyone argue that the integrity of the Quaker faith was advanced by its association with Richard Nixon, or the disciples of Christ with Lyndon Johnson, or for that matter, Ronald Reagan? The two Southern Baptist presidents of the late 20th century, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, left decidedly different legacies. One left office with his reputation for probity intact, but he was generally considered a less than effective president. The other presidency was considerably more successful, especially in terms of balancing the budget, foreign policy initiatives, and economic prosperity. But probity was hardly that president's forte. Nearly 4 centuries ago, Roger Williams recognized the dangers to the faith of too close an association with the state. He worried that the garden of the church would be sullied by the wilderness of the world, if not for a wall of separation between the two. Neither Williams nor the founders proposed to bracket an individual's faith from political considerations, but they discerned the dangers of conflating the two. And here I want to just take a minute to point out, as I'm sure you all know, Puritans like Roger Williams, and he was initially a Puritan, didn't share our romantic Sierra Club post-Thoreauian notions about wilderness, right? Wilderness for them was a place of danger. It was where evil lurked. And so when Roger Williams talks about protecting the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world by means of a wall of separation, those are all his metaphors, he was concerned about protecting the integrity of the faith from being sullied by politicization or fetishization. David was kind enough to mention that I was one of the expert witnesses in the Alabama Ten Commandments case, and I'm going to take a quick detour to give you an anecdote from that case. As you know, this was Judge Roy Moore, who had been elected. In Alabama, they elect Supreme Court justices. He was elected Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court as the Ten Commandments. He ran as being the Ten Commandments judge because he had put the Ten Commandments on his courtroom in Gadsden, Alabama, when he was a lower court judge. And he, of course, brought this 2.5-ton granite monument into the lobby of the Judicial Building, emblazoned with the Ten Commandments. That was his big thing. At the same time, he refused any other religious representations in that space, even though other religious groups in Alabama said, we want to post our principles too. Even the Alabama Atheist Association, both members no doubt, asked to have their sentiments posted in that space, and Moore said no. And this clearly violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which is precisely what Judge Myron Thompson ruled in his decision on that monument. When the workers were preparing to remove the monument in accordance with the court order, one of the protesters screamed, "Get your hands off my God." Unless I miss my guess, one of those commandments says something about a graven image. And that precisely was Roger Williams' point. When you allow a blurring of church and state, when you allow the garden of the church to be contaminated by the wilderness of the world, it is the faith that suffers. It's the integrity of the faith that suffers. And that is why Roger Williams made that declaration, and that, I think, is terribly appropriate to talking about religion and politics. Let me read one more paragraph. I forget what paragraph I had. Here we go. Should a candidate's faith matter to voters? The record of the final 4 decades of the 20th century and the initial years of the 21st century suggests that professions of religious belief on the campaign trail do not provide a good indicator of how a president comports himself in office. There is, in short, no direct correlation between probity and policy. Jimmy Carter may provide something of an exception to that generalization, but few Americans view his administration with nostalgia, even though he's redeemed himself in the eyes of many Americans with his activities since leaving office. Ronald Reagan evokes a lot of nostalgia, especially among conservatives, but he was singularly unsuccessful in following through on the campaign promises that he insisted were motivated by his religious convictions. I think I'm out of time. David was kind enough to mention this notion of cheap grace, and let me just tell you a little bit broader context what I mean by that. That is, I think over the last half century or so, at least twice, we voters have engaged in what I call cheap grace. Voting for a candidate for office who pledges to redeem the nation from the sins of his predecessor. Jimmy Carter, referring, of course, to Richard Nixon, and also George W. Bush, referring to Bill Clinton. And I use the term cheap grace because I think in both cases, we, the voters, pushed the lever for these candidates. And in so doing, we sought to whitewash our own complicity. Richard Nixon's entire political career was littered with dirty tricks. And this was, his nickname, of course, was Tricky Dick, not without reason. We knew that as voters when we elected a president in 1968. And not only that, but we re-elected him 4 years later in 1972. We were content with that. Everything blew up, of course, with the Watergate scandal. The Republic, I think, probably in the eyes of many Americans, teetered pretty close to the brink during the Watergate crisis. But by voting for Jimmy Carter in 1976, we were able to put that aside and fail to implicate ourselves, why Nixon was there in the first place. Bill Clinton, Jennifer Flowers, remember that name? We knew about Bill Clinton. We knew about his personal foibles, his weaknesses before we put him into office. And sure enough, in the course of his administration, tragically, all of these things came to the surface with the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And so in 2000, we simply clicked the lever for George W. Bush and tried to put it all beside us. Failing to ask questions about our society, our collective tolerance for transitional relationships, our tolerance for pornography, our sexual abandon in the culture. Pushing the lever for George W. Bush in 2000 allowed us to absolve ourselves of this. This is what I mean by cheap grace, which David mentioned in the course of the introduction. I'm happy to talk about this a little bit more, but I think I better be quiet at this point. Thank you for your attention. Appreciate it.